All right, this is Christian, and today I have John Vandivier. Vandivier? Okay, I always pronounce his name wrong. I always butcher his name. But anyway, today we'll talk about what you need to know before you get started with React. John is a React developer, a front-end developer, and he's also teaching web dev. And today he's gonna pick my brain, and I'm gonna pick his brain when it comes to learning the React, what you need to know before you get started with React, and what you should be expecting as you are diving into this technology. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna give the floor to John. If you wanna say something about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. So I have about a decade of experience. I think if we're being more precise, it's closer to 8 years. I'm a principal developer currently at Blue Cross. However, my notice is in, and I can't tell you exactly where I'm going, but it is paying somewhere in there. So that is my professional credentials. From an academic perspective, I also have a PhD in economics. And my thesis, what I studied, is the ability to land a job on the basis of alternative credentials. So a GitHub portfolio would be an example of an alternative credential that's relevant here. And yeah, I do have a teachable course. It's in early access. It's an alpha. And that's ladderly.io. Ladderly like a ladder, like you're climbing the corporate ladder. So really excited for this discussion today. Yeah, the things that you need to know before you dive into React, totally relevant to that Ladderly course as much as anything you're doing, I'm sure.
Sure. By the way, all John's socials will be in the description of this video, so you can check them out after you finish watching this video. I guess I'll start with my philosophy with React, and then you can tell me yours, or you can comment on mine. So the way I see React and web dev in general and front end is the ability to get some data, right? Arrays, objects, etc., and then display it in a nice format so the user can understand the data and interact with the data. Yeah. So this is the premise that I'm basing my whole program off of. Okay. And I start that from the moment people start working with JavaScript. I see when you start off with JavaScript, you start clicking on buttons and you open models and you change class names, and that's fine because it gets into that flow of, oh, I can actually do this. But then at some point you need to get into building some apps, a few key apps actually. And those apps for me are the To-Do app and the Pomodoro and the To-Do app, because I put them.
Oh, nice.
So they make the To-Do app, and then after they finish that, they have to create a Pomodoro that interacts with the To-Do app, you know?
Very nice.
Yeah. So the reason why I chose those apps is because, first of all, the To-Do app is just an array, and you have to filter items from the array, you have to modify items from the array, you have to like update them, you have to add items into the array. And that is teaching you that, hey, everything at the end of the day, it's either an array or an object. Okay. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think that's wonderful. At the end of the day, everything's either an array or an object. I agree with that. Yeah. Especially in JavaScript world, where behind the scenes, everything's an object.
Yep.
When I'm onboarding people into programming, by the way, do you do that in vanilla? Is that the idea?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. So I think what you're pointing at is before you get into React, you should know basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right?
Yep, of course.
And I totally agree. So my students, I do a similar thing, but I don't do those apps. I love those app ideas. What we do is I will do a blog.
A blog. Okay.
Very boring, but I think it's underrated for this reason. Once the student has created the blog, they're actually putting their real blog entries. And it's a great talking point during the interview. They can have a GitHub pages where the interviewer can go view it, and they can say, look, I'm not just consuming content, I'm creating content now, and I'm actually contributing. So I think that's a great talking point. So I do the blog, and I also do, I like to do your resume.
Mm-hmm.
That one is pretty boring, but it's just very, very easy for them to understand what they're doing. I think the mental model is very easy. Just take your resume and make it into an HTML page.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time I have those two, now I have a reason to do the third one. And these are the three basic ones that I do, which is a very basic portfolio site.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Linktree,
Yeah.
just like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just an array of links. They're
Yeah.
not even like objects. It's just an array of, well, yeah, they are, because you have the text that shows up and you have the href. So they're also an array of objects, but I'm sure it's less complicated than a to-do object. And you just have a few links that show up like that, specifically for the blog and for the resume.
Sure.
I think if you only
Can I
have
ask you,
one item in your portfolio,
when it comes to creating the blog post, are you actually making like a proper website, like with links, or just a
it's
huge
just,
of posts?
yeah, it's just an array of articles. So I use that opportunity to talk about a bit about many of my students. I will be teaching them HTML.
Mm-hmm.
So while I agree that you need to know HTML before React, I don't necessarily say you need to know HTML before I work with you.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're doing the basic vanilla blog, I use that opportunity to talk about semantic tags.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we're actually using the article tag and section tag.
Are you big on that? I don't really care about semantic HTML. I never cared about it. Maybe because in your field of work, you've been kind of forced to use those. But in all the companies I've been working in at or whatever, divs, buttons, links, they are working just fine, you know.
Div is quite useful. Yeah, I think you can often use a div. The reason that I care about semantics is for two reasons. One is for sometimes the SEO matters. In many cases, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And then also sometimes it helps the screen reader.
Got it.
And again, in some cases it doesn't. So if you're dealing with a semantic tag that a screen reader doesn't understand and SEO is irrelevant, you really don't need that semantic tag, right?
Yeah, because I've been only working with internal tools and there are only charts, graphs, apps, things of that nature.
Yeah.
So there's no need. No, that makes sense. Well, I guess we have this a similar approach, because you are asking them to build a blog post, or I'm asking them to build a to-do app, right?
Yeah.
Which is literally the same thing, but the initial data looks different. Now, when do you feel like a student generally is ready to go to React?
That's a good question. So my answer is I don't know. So I have at the end of so let's take a step back. Even before we go to the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I think there's another item that's just as important as those combined. And that is the motivation and the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
So with people that I've talked to, even if they're not my students, even if I've just done a consult call and we're trying to decide, is this even what you want to do?
Mm-hmm. The
motivation for me is one of the biggest factors that I've seen that will determine whether they actually stick with it or not. Yeah. One of the first things that I like to do, even before we touch code, is talk about things like, why do you want to work in tech? And I'm also trying to convince them. I'm not just interrogating them. I'm also trying to persuade them. Tech's really great, you know? And even in tech, we have tech sales, we have business analyst, product manager, designer. So why programmer? Mm-hmm. And again, I'm using this as an opportunity to persuade them and motivate them, as well as to get them to understand the big picture. Tech industry has higher salary. Even within tech industry, programmers have higher salary. Mm-hmm. The employment rate is better. The ability to work remote, it's fabulous, right? You know this. So I will talk to them about why tech and why code. This is part of the big picture. I like to talk to them, you know, why would you work with me instead of go to a college or a boot camp? I think that's important. This may be controversial. I'm not sure if you're a fan of this. I will often point them to external resources before I take them on. So I like the Codecademy Pro.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they're trying to do that, if they're spinning their wheels, I know you talk about tutorial hell.
Yeah.
That's when I say, now you're a better fit for me. But honestly, I'm going to charge you too much. If you can just do it on your own, that's what I did, is I did the Codecademy Pro.
Yeah.
So that starts to get at the answer of when are you ready? For me, when I did Codecademy Pro, I got to the end of the course, I got a certificate. I took the certificate and I started applying to jobs.
Was Codecademy a thing 8 years ago, though?
It was, however, the Pro was not.
Uh-huh.
So it was actually kind of nice in a way because it was just free. Although the quality was a bit lower, but it was completely free.
Yeah, yeah.
So I got the certificate, and I think this is really important. You need objective third-party validation.
You think
That
so?
can be a referral or a reference from Christian. He is my objective validation. Or that can be some LinkedIn skill assessment. That can be some, Indeed also has a skill assessment, Indeed.com. Or the certificate or from a boot camp or an online course. So I took it, I applied to jobs. Now I immediately started failing all of the interviews.
The first one is always going to be bombed, you know.
I failed a dozen. So for me, it took me a year to get comfortable with front-end code and land my job. So for some people, it's fine. For some people, a year is fine if they're self-taught. In hindsight, it might have been smart for me to work with somebody else, and we could have cut that time in half, you know?
You know what? So I think you covered my question from a different angle, but I do agree with you. Like everyone that jumps on a call with me to figure out if we are ready to work together, I have to kind of find out what they want. And money is also a big motivator for people to get into tech, into React. But I find that if money is the only motivator, it's going to be pretty difficult for them.
I agree.
The transition. You know, even though I made a video the other day, coding is about money. I said, yeah, I wanted the money, but I was also passionate about coding, even though right now I'm not really that much into it. You know, it's just like brushing my teeth, you know, or going to the gym. It's something that I do. I'm not excited as people are on the rest of the social media, you know. And yeah, if the money is the only motivator that people have, they're gonna have a very, very hard time making it. Because the way I put it is that your mind, your logic is there, right? It makes sense. You learn code, you grind for a few months or maybe a year, then you get 70K or 80K as an entry level, then you'll make 100 grand, then you'll work remotely, blah, blah, blah. But if your heart, that's how I put it, if your heart is not with that logical decision, I don't think you'll be able to make it, you know. Like, if you are not ready to go to the gym, you're not going to make the most out of it. You're not committed enough, you know, because if you just lank the weights like that, nothing is going to happen. But if your heart is like, okay, I really need to do something about it, you'll pay extreme attention to every single rep that you're doing. You're going to make sure that all your muscles are contracted properly and so on and so forth. And that's when we'll see real quick and real good results, you know.
I agree. Let me talk for a few seconds about that. So one thing, we can bring in some science here. When a person has an emotional connection to a concept, their memory is activated, and they actually retain that information better. So that's one reason, is they're just going to remember things better if it's something they care about. A second thing is related to the motivation. It's just so boring. You know, if you do not find it interesting, how are you going to stick with it? It's so boring for you.
You look at my name, Boring Christian.
Yeah. I think one of the solutions to this is let the learner pick their projects. So I do have my standard projects. One thing is I always tell the learner, if you don't want to do these, we don't have to do these. We can do something else. Sure. Two is those are usually pretty quick, and we can usually get through them in a few sessions and then move on to something that the learner picks. So when the learner is in the driver's seat, it's going to be something relevant to them. And in fact, it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something relevant to them, their motivation and their interest, their heart is going to be in it more. I know you've done some things with music in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe an app that does something with music. Also, when it comes time for them to interview finally, with my students, I'm always driving this home. The interview is just as important as the coding skill itself. It's arguably more, if your goal is to land the job. The talking points with your interviewer are going to be authentic, and they're going to come across as authentic if it's a project that you actually care about. The blog is like a great place to start. I actually like that because they write their own blog articles. So it's hard for them to present the blog without turning it into their personal story.
Mm-hmm.
But consider the other one, consider the portfolio app. If that was your only project, this is terrible. This is terrible first project or only project,
Mm-hmm.
because there's nothing unique to you about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention it's technically very basic and so forth.
Yeah, I see.
I do have, going back to the original point, when are they ready for React? I do have a technical opinion there as well, but we can talk about that later if you have something first.
So when they start and they're doing their JavaScript apps, when they get to that Pomodoro plus to do app, once they've done it right, because I make them do it in the React way without them knowing about it, and then they will feel limited or suppressed by JavaScript. They'll be like, then this is too much. There is too much code. There are so many things happening in here, and that's when I say, this is React.
Yeah,
and
that's perfect.
Now it makes sense. Okay, now I understand why I need it. Because if I show you React before you've been struggling with it, or if I show you style components before you wrote a bunch of CSS with a bunch of class names, then you're not gonna appreciate the tool. Because all the tools that we have, they are made to make our life easier. But if you've never had your life difficult, you'll never appreciate, this kind of tool, and it's gonna make the learning really quick. And you were talking about this being boring. Yes, it's extremely boring, especially in the beginning while you are getting your ABCs, while you have to get how functions, how loops, how if-else statements work, how variables work. It's extremely, extremely boring because there's literally zero output from it, or zero meaningful output, and you have to kind of stick to that phrase and grind to it and wait, but be also committed to doing the work every day, so you can finally understand it. You cannot just show up. Some people say, oh, 80% of the success is just showing up. Yeah, but if you show up and then you leave, then it's not gonna happen. Maybe the first 2 weeks, yeah, just show up for 5-10 minutes, but then at some point you have to decide that I want to stick with this boring period until at some point this whole thing is gonna click for me and it's gonna make sense. That's how I kind of see it.
I agree. I did a TikTok on this recently. Feel free to follow me on TikTok. My handle is just John Vandivier, my name.
The links will be in the description. Yeah. So
thank you. So what you're referring to here is related to, I gave 5 tips how to learn anything. Mm-hmm. So somebody asked me, how can I get better at backend development? I said, let's take a step back and talk about how you can learn anything. Then we will talk about the backend specifically. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the difference between just showing up and showing up with intention and being deliberate.
With intent, yeah.
Yeah. So just showing up, there's something called the 10,000 hour rule. Have you heard this? So yeah. Malcolm Gladwell had a book called Outliers, where he documented that some of the world's prodigies, violinists and so forth, have put 10,000 hours from the time they're born to the time they're 18 or 20, I think it was. And that just practice is the main driver of why they're so good. So first of all, he's right. But second of all, there were some problems with his thesis. Mm-hmm. So one of the ways that you can reduce from 10,000 hours to something sensible is being deliberate. intentional learning.
Yep.
So for us as programmers, projects, learning by doing with your projects, and I use GitHub. I don't know if you do the same, but that's an example of intentional learning. And especially when, as we mentioned earlier, when those projects are something the learner has picked or the learner is passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
You're really getting all the bonus points at that point. The idea that you're going to wait until JavaScript becomes onerous and then present React as a solution,
Mm-hmm.
that's the sign of a perfect teacher. Yeah. I try to do the same. I don't know if I can do as well as you, but with the blog, once they have the articles, first they're writing the articles in plain HTML. Then they are doing a form with JavaScript so that they can add and delete articles.
Mm-hmm.
There's no database, of course. It's just on the front end in memory. However, so they're using the document API,
Mm-hmm.
right? Get element by ID, get element by class, get elements by class name,
Mm-hmm.
append child, and so forth. After they've familiarized themselves with those operations, that's when I turn to React. And I say, this is actually what React is doing for you.
Mm-hmm. So you are introducing it much earlier than me then.
I'm not sure, possibly. But that's the time that I do it. Because I think if you do it before then, if you bring in React before you've dealt with the document API, you're training a terrible React developer. They don't know what's actually going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's true.
And I've been on the hiring side of this too, where I've seen whether it's a React developer or an Angular developer, the person will know the framework and have no clue about the underlying JavaScript, right? And on the one hand, that's sort of confusing for me because that's not the path that I did. I learned vanilla, and then it was the jQuery days, and then finally Angular. So by the time I got to Angular, I had a thorough understanding of what's underneath. But some of the boot camps, they're flying so quickly, their pace, they're not customizing the pace, right?
Yep.
That's a great reason to work with a mentor or a coach, is that we can speed up if you're capable, and we can slow it down if you need extra time. The boot camp can't afford to do this. They're doing the one size fits all of the pace.
Push you through, boom, 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 boom.
Yeah. And so some percentage of those students, maybe around 10, 20%, they end up knowing the basics of the framework, but they never really caught on to what's underneath. And that's a big problem.
You need to have time to get bored by the basic stuff before you get into the cool stuff.
Yeah.
Always, always, always. And the way I see it, let me just see if I can do this. Maybe you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. Because the way I see it is like, when you're a beginner, there is like this huge funnel, okay? So here you're a complete beginner. So here you have to find out kind of what's your learning style, what are the resources that you have to work with. And then as you progress, this funnel becomes narrower and narrower. And then at some point you get here. When you get here, you can go through a standardized process, you know? So for me, when people get, let's say over here, they are ready for React because they have the understanding of what JavaScript is, how everything works, and now they can go through a standardized process, you know? But before that, if they're a complete beginner, I have to try, I give them a bunch of free resources. If I will give them those free resources and they will be by themselves, they will take 6 months to go through them, mainly because they are unsure if what they're doing is right or wrong. But with me, I can shorten that from 6 months to 1 month or 2 months, you know? So I have to go through that funnel with them until they reach the React stage, and then everything is very, very standardized, you know? Have you found a similar pattern with your students?
To some extent. So let me talk about where I agree that I think you made a really key point. And this is another thing that we do, it seems we both do, that the boot camp really doesn't do. Or a standardized curriculum, even if it's not a boot camp, if it's an online course pre-recorded, it cannot tailor, it cannot personalize to you. And that's really a big problem. We know in the education space, personalized learning is far more effective than one size fits all is the term that I'm using. There's other terms for that. So you called out personalized learning, and I think that's really important. And I do that with my students too. Now, one thing that you said is that you give them resources and ask them to figure it out.
No, I don't ask them to figure it out. I give them something, and then
Okay.
based on what they're doing, then I figure out, okay, let me try this. And then,
Sure.
that's kind of how I see it.
So I'm not sure about the details of that process, but depending on how you do that, that could be quite generous in a strange way. So with my learners, I'm happy to give them extra attention and extra hours, but I'm charging them. And I'm letting them know, hey, if you can do this on your own, it's going to be cheaper for you. So if that's what you're doing, you could be saving them a lot of money. And also testing for motivation, because again, motivation is so important. If the learner is willing to look through the documentation on their own, do the exercises on their own, and bring questions to you in a proactive manner, that is a brilliant sign for that learner. They have wonderful potential already.
Yep.
For me, it sort of depends on your mentoring style. We talked about learning style, but I guess mentoring style is important here too. Are you interested in hand-holding? You know the phrase hand-holding?
No, I don't. I'm not interested in that.
Yeah. So some developers, it just doesn't make sense. My attitude is I don't really like to do it, but if you pay me enough, I'll do it. So I let them know up front. I don't want to be tricking anyone, but I let them know up front, these are some gaps that you're missing. And then I tell them, I'm happy to meet with you. Basically, like, you're not ready yet. I'm happy to meet with you. Here's my hourly rate. Or you can just kind of go figure it out. So if I do meet with them, I am personalizing that information. And I think it's similar to what you said. Maybe 6 months on their own, we could turn that into like a month if you're meeting once or twice a week.
But people don't understand, like, they seem to never understand the time lost equation.
Absolutely. This is the hardest thing, whether it's a student or a professional who's already in the industry.
Anyone.
Even a manager, right? Even a manager. I have special training in this as an economist. The time value of money, opportunity cost of time.
Yeah.
Even in common magazines, you may occasionally catch someone talking about opportunity cost. A journalist might mention in Forbes magazine or Business Insider, one of the finance savvy magazines, they might mention opportunity cost, but inevitably they're talking about dollars, right? And there's a deeper meaning of opportunity cost, that it's not just dollars. There's an opportunity cost. Right? Yeah, there's an opportunity cost of your time. And this is something I didn't even understand when I was learning. I told you it took me a year to land my first job. What if I had landed that in 4, 5, or 6 months and been working for the remaining 6 months? I would have earned many, many, many times more than whatever I would have given to some course or some mentor or even a boot camp.
For sure.
I haven't really figured out how to solve for that. But it is a problem.
It's still something that I'm trying to quantify right now in my actual content, because I have to bring this, like, to work with me, it costs X amount of dollars, right? And you usually make it back after you get paid for 1 month of work,
Yeah.
So if I help you get there 1 month faster, you already made your money back, and you're more confident and everything, But definitely people don't really know how to quantify that. And it's actually because we are also trained as employees, so as employees, we don't see time as valuable, or we don't see our time valuable. We only see our time valuable when we get paid for it, But because we are trained in economics, and I run a business and you run a business as well, we start to see that, right? Because if you would have made X amount of money before this period of time, you could have done this and this and this, and you could have prevented that, or you could have invested into this thing, and
maybe that's one way to talk about it. I haven't tried this. Maybe you can try it out and let me know. But if you have someone who is an employee, I think you're right about the employee mindset. I think you're right about that. And economists will tell you, this is sort of like undergraduate. This is not even advanced. If you ask somebody, what is your time worth? the hourly wage at their job is a fairly good estimate, actually. The problem is they forget that their off hours are also worth that.
Yeah.
So yeah, think about this as an investment. So maybe this is the way that you can talk to them. I'll try this also. Does this employee, person who's working 9-to-5 job, do they have an investment account? Because I think you're quite right. If you think about this as an investment, the logic is clear that it's a great idea.
It is an investment.
Yeah. So how many years did it take you to double your savings just using the investment account? It could take 5, 10, 20 years to double your savings. What if I could double your income? I don't know if that's true for you, but some of the people that I work with, that's true, some not. Sometimes it's increased by 20%, 40, 50, it depends. But if you can cast the question as an investment, I mean, the idea of making a 20% return in a year on your savings account, that's wonderful. That's quite good performance, right?
Yeah, 100%. Let's go back to React because you've deviated so much from the whole thing.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I would like to talk about this, but we clickbaited people into React.
So I think you need to know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then I was clear that I think when it comes to JavaScript, obviously you need to know the basics where you're talking about functions and loops, conditional statements, keywords. I like to use the debugger keyword.
I never used it.
Okay, that's fine. But
I never used that. I love, I'm a console log developer,
That's fine. See, what I was going to say is the bigger picture is they need a bit of training on debugging. Just debugging in general. So console log, I also use the alert sometimes. So console log or alert in debugger, I try to touch on all three. Sometimes I hit them, sometimes I don't. But they're going to get the concept of debugging. There's a mindset aspect here when it comes to debugging. It's the test-driven development idea. So I'm not having them write unit tests, but I want them to think in that way. So how do you think in that way is when I type my code, I hit save. Before I open the web page, I want to imagine what do I expect to occur and why. So it's kind of like you're writing the test case in your head. Even though you don't know how to write unit tests, you're forming your expectation. Then you go look at the web page. Did it work? No. What was the actual result? And you can already, you're the student, you don't have this vocabulary, but what you're actually doing is you're already starting the root cause analysis.
Yeah. I do that without realizing, and now it makes sense why I do it.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful skill, and that is a huge benefit when you get into React, because we know React makes things easier in some ways, but the mental model, let's be clear, the mental model is trickier in some ways. So you need to be able to clearly state, what do I expect and why? And one of the pain points that you'll see is, oh, I expected that because that's how the document API does it. That's not how React does it. One of the ones that I mentioned earlier that I run into this specifically is get element by ID is a singular element. And get elements by class name or tag name is plural, right? And that's always a case where the switchover sort of fails. And the idea of, so I usually teach hooks. I think the class way is a little bit older. But the idea of use ref and referencing an element that way throws many of my students off. And so it's easy to solve once you've identified the gap. And you have to identify the gap by teaching your student to communicate with you technically. What did you expect and why? Technically, tell me why you expected that. Because that's how the document gets elements, right? That's not how React does it.
That's a good one. Okay, I'm gonna analyze that and think how I can put it into my program. Look, I wanna share with you another thing that I'm doing, and I think I've invented this. I have no idea if I did. Maybe I did, maybe I don't, but the way I look at it, there is a big problem sometimes when you have a bunch of components, and especially when you migrate the React app to Redux, you start to have problems with passing data down and things like that. You know what I mean, right?
Oh, it's the worst. Yeah.
Yeah, I had so I came up with this concept that I'm still trying to refine until I'm gonna actually make a video about it, because I'm still trying it out. So it's called the river method. So you have a spring, and then the river flows into the sea or in the ocean, right? Most of the times, people start to debug in the middle of the river, and they
Yeah.
don't know if they want to go up or down. And then the point is to either start from the spring, from where the data comes from, either from the Redux action when you put it into your reducer, and then go down and see, okay, this is the first component that takes the data, console log it there. Then this component, console log it there. Or you can start from the component that reads it, and then you go up to the parent and then grandparent and so on and so forth until you reach the action. So in this way, you can follow the data, and then you can see where it breaks. You know, does this concept make sense?
It absolutely makes sense.
Did
I'll
I
talk
invent
about
it?
you may have you certainly invented the terminology, and I think the terminology is important. But the idea of this is just like good debugging technique, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good root cause analysis technique.
Mm-hmm.
One of the terms that I've heard is when you're looking at a data tree, we'll talk about debugging from the leaf, from the leaf node. So in your case, that's like the very end consumer component.
The ocean, yeah.
Or the origin, exactly. So I think you're teaching the same idea, but like I like the language that you're using. So I will mention three things here. One is, if we're in vanilla world, the idea of passing props down through React, it's, in my experience, it's very foreign to vanilla world. So when I'm getting into React, that's one of the first things that I teach is, hey, this is just like React stuff. It's new stuff you haven't been doing. Use state, use effect. The idea of a component, like actually having different files with a component. And passing props down. At that time, that's a new thing. I guess we could like change what we do in vanilla world to make that less new. There are things like web components, but frankly, I think those are like too complex. And why am I teaching them web components when I could teach them React? But maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe someone else will have a curriculum and show that it's a better way. The thing that's actually strangely more intuitive to my students is Redux. Now, actions and reducers, that's all very strange. But the idea of a global store seems, they pick that up very easily, because in vanilla world, at least you have global variables and you can just have a global object, right?
Interesting, yeah.
So, and when it comes to actions reducers, frankly, I skim over that stuff and I don't go into the details. With the Redux toolkit, are you using the toolkit way lately? No. Okay, so the Redux toolkit, in the recent versions of Redux, you really don't need to know how actions work. They kind of hide it from you, and it's really, really nice. You should check it out. So let's see, let me briefly check if I have anything like that on mine. Yeah. So may I share my screen for a second?
Yeah, go for it.
This is just the counter slicer example. So this is like a very, I think if you use create React app with the Redux flag, it will generate it like this for you these days. So this, well, actually this says a year ago. So, but it's using Redux toolkit, create slice. So this create slice.
I've seen something in the docs about this, but I just went over it.
Yeah, it's in the newer version of Redux. Let's see. I can tell you which version. Look at my package.json file. It's like 1.4 or later, I suppose. There's this Redux, there's this create slice method. So I talk to my students about slices rather than actions. So a slice is like a sub-store. So I have my top level store, and then that has a counter property, and that's here on the slice name. And that is the substore that contains the counter slice. That's where all that state is going to live. Here's the initial state, value 0.
Mhm.
So that would be 0
Mhm.
initially. And then this is just the counter example. So they're clicking, and to increment it, it goes up. Decrement it button, that's a different button. It goes down, dispatches that action. But you see right here, that's all the complexity that, if you're using the slice, that's all the complexity of writing your action.
Interesting.
So they almost don't even know, they almost don't even need to know what it does. They just know, oh, actions are those things that you dispatch.
Mm-hmm.
And that they do need to know, because they need to know about the dispatch method. I'm doing it the hooks way, so dispatch equals use dispatch, right? But it's really fairly trivial at this point. It used to be extremely complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But now that we have the dispatch hook, and now that we have the create slice,
Mm-hmm.
they do need to know it. You do need to mention it. Hey, you're going to have to dispatch this action, but it's just not a complicated thing anymore. Dispatching an abstraction basically looks like invoking a function now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's all that I wanted to share on that. Yeah, so if I delve into the weeds of actions and reducers, that's extremely complicated. Oh, by the way, this is the third thing that I wanted to mention, the last thing I'll mention. Your debugging strategy, you're quite right. You can start at the parent component if the parent is passing it down, or you can start at the consumer. But if you're doing this slices way, you can also put a debugger in the reducer itself.
Or in the reducer, yeah.
Yeah. And so I usually will do that before I go to the parent. That's the last thing that I would mention.
I actually never debug in the reducer. I always debug in the action most of the time. But it's pretty much the same thing, yeah. You mentioned something that I wanted to address. Yeah, no, I wanted to say that you are using a lot of the newer stuff, and now it might sound that I'm using a lot of the old stuff, but actually, whenever I start with someone, I ask them to do it the old way. So the classes. So for example, they have to build an app with 6 or 7 pages, right? That's their portfolio app. And they have to create the main page and then a page that's going to use component updates. So like it's the search page or something like that, where you have to check if the params changed. And if they changed, you have to fetch data again, you know, for that specific search term or something like that. So once they do that, that's when they actually learn hooks, because it happens that you'll be working on a project where you have to use classes, and if you don't know the classes, then you'll be fired straight away if you don't understand it, you know. So that's from my experience. So they have to know classes, and then they'll appreciate the hooks more, you know.
I think that's quite right. And I do end up teaching classes, but I do it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And your way could be better. The way that I teach it is that I teach them the way that I would do this. So that is functional components and hooks. And then we run into a problem because the error boundary doesn't have a hook.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So that's when I teach them about classes. I say, yeah, there's this weird thing. The error boundary is very important. We need to catch those errors. And for some strange reason, it's only available in class components. Mm-hmm. So now they have to learn the class component. And the other reason that I think class components are quite important, even though I don't make them my primary thing, but I do end up teaching it. So I teach it at the end. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the wrong way, because I like the logic that you have, which is let's introduce the new technology when it solves a pain point. Mm-hmm. And that actually, if it's making the person happier, if they're feeling, again, back to the emotional level, if they just feel happier, oh, this is nice, they're going to remember it better. Mm-hmm. I teach them classes at the end with the error boundary, and when we're starting to go into the interview job preparation phase. Mm-hmm. Because at the very start of the job preparation phase, I have them do skill assessments. Mm-hmm. And almost all of the skill assessments are still asking some questions about the classes. Mm-hmm. So that's when I do a class review.
Sure. I guess my approach is always like give them the hard stuff, then show them the easy way. Then after they introduce the hooks, they have to add Redux. Mm-hmm. but I don't show them like the newer versions of Redux because I've never encountered them in practice. So maybe in the future I'm gonna look into this toolkit. Maybe it's gonna make life easier for them. But if it's gonna make life easier for them, then I'm gonna ask them to do it after they've done it the old way, you know. So
Yeah. I
there's
think one thing that I would want to talk about, if there's a little more time left,
sure.
is a few things that you definitely don't need
Mhm.
before you start React, huh?
Sure. Yeah, let's go for it.
So I think there's a lot of great skills in tech. There's way too many. And some of those, when you're interviewing, you can use them as a nice to have, but they're not the essentials. And even if they are the essentials, like Redux, I think is quite essential today.
Mhm.
It's not something you would learn before React, right?
Yeah.
So what are some examples of the things that you may not need? I think your point about semantic tags is a great point. Technically, you don't need it. I like to bring it up because it's a talking point, and it's a nice to have, but technically you don't need it. When we look at HTML, there's some other things that technically you don't need. You don't need to know all the HTML tags. Video tag. Some of the tags you absolutely ought to avoid, like the B tag.
The blink tag, you know the blink tag?
Yeah. No. What is this? Or the BR?
No, it blinks, so it changes color from like background unset to background red or something like that.
It's absurd.
It blinks. It's like a police car.
Absolutely absurd. You're gonna give someone a seizure.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, some developers, and after I've started working with them, they won't make this mistake. But if they're on my TikTok, if they're like, I started learning on my own, and I've noticed this is similar to the tutorial hell. They will be stuck in HTML tag hell, which is actually a lower circle than the tutorial hell. It's worse.
Yeah, I see. I've
Or
seen
CSS
that.
keyword hell, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with CSS, this is an example of personalized learning. Depending on the student, I will either go through CSS in one session, or we might have 3, 4, 5 sessions if they enjoy the art.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where I'm learning their learning style and I'm personalizing it to them. Do they want to do the CSS animations, or is that an absolute waste of time?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to depend on their preferences. Technically, you don't need it, right? So I think it's essential to know certain things like italics is one that I think is important, or weights. If I'm just thinking of in a basic Word document, what are the basics? Font size, font color, font weight, italics, underline, and the background color. And that's basically it. Those are the ones that I think are very important. And then if they are hating CSS, I will move forward into React. And yes, we'll circle back when we go to style the React components, but I think they get enough of it at that point. But if they're like, wow, I made a circle, some students are just infatuated with the shapes they can make, huh? So I'm very happy to have them develop some expertise there, because frankly, when you get to the job interview step, that's quite a resource for some employers, that you are the developer who can do animations. Wow, that really impresses some people.
I was that guy.
Nice.
I was that guy. I was obsessed with CSS mainly because I couldn't understand JavaScript. So I said, okay, I'm not going to get this. So at least I'm going to get very good at CSS and HTML. Nice. But it's interesting because for me, when it comes to CSS, margin, padding, width, height.
You're right. I should have mentioned those.
Flex direction, justify content, and align items. With these 8 properties and font size, color, and background, so 11 properties, you can do pretty much anything. Like 95% of the work is done with these 5 rules.
So you're quite right. Let me ask you this, because one discussion is you ought to learn Flex. I agree 100%. But the other discussion is when. And I think there's 2 ways to do it, and I really don't know which is better. So I'd love your opinion. One is you teach them CSS. You teach them at CSS time early. The other is when they get to React, you can introduce React itself is not enough. We need Redux. We also need material or something like this. And introducing the grid, now you need to describe Flex, right? So yeah, your opinion then would be learn it the CSS way and introduce the grid later, or what would your opinion be?
So they are building two types of apps, right? They can
Mm.
choose either the crypto app, which is data driven, so internal tools, and then the other one is the Unsplash app, and it looks like Instagram, you know. If you are choosing the photo app, basically, you're not allowed to use any kind of CSS framework, nothing. You have to do it by yourself. On the other hand, if you are choosing the data-driven app, I'm going to let you choose any kind of CSS framework you want, just because because they have a bunch of columns and details, they might need that kind of help, you know. But for the photo type of app, I don't think they should rely on a framework. That's my opinion with that. Introducing Flex should be done quite early. So if I have a complete beginner, I ask them to go through the free code camp HTML and CSS section, and then I have 5 challenges of my own, you know, that grow in difficulty. And the last website, or the last website that they have to build is the Nike website. So the Nike landing page, and they have to make it one-on-one. So it has to look one-on-one, you know, and that's when their Flexbox skills get tested, you know.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so I introduced it quite early on. Yeah, I'm very focused on that.
What do you think about dates? I think dates are another example where you need to know the basic, how to create a date, but I don't think you need to know the intricacies of like UTF time started in 1969 or 89 or whatever it is.
70?
That, yeah, was it 70? There you go.
70, yeah.
I think that's a tangent that can be avoided. I think also the file reader API is another thing we can avoid. Yeah, so I think with problems like these, one thing that I like to do is when we've completed the 3 basic projects, I ask them to come up with their own projects, and I let them stub their toes. And I think at that point, you're becoming a true developer, and you can use the API when you decide you need it, and you're doing the Google search, and it comes up, and you try it out, and it works. But I don't think we need to teach you all that in front. You sort of find it as you go, and that's the way it is to be a developer for the rest of your life.
Sure. For me, I find it. I find CSS grid not needed at all. I don't think it's. I mean, you can learn it after, and I don't think it's a big deal. But things that I don't need, things that you don't need. Being a designer is not needed, and everyone kind of has this idea that if they go into front end, they have to be designers. Another misconception is that you'll build websites, which is not really true. You are building apps with website technologies.
Yeah.
So they might have this idea that they'll become web designers, and that's a totally different skill, aka making WordPress websites. And it's not about technology there, but it's about like providing business value or driving traffic to a website and converting traffic that comes to a website, you know. So there are different skills. I guess the semantics there are important. What else? When it comes to choosing their own projects, I have 2 standard projects that I give them, and then if they have designs and everything for all of them, so they don't have to think about it. And I do this mainly because they will be doing that at work. So I'll give them sometimes freedom to choose features in their own apps, but mostly I want to keep them being developers rather than them coming up with ideas and stuff like that, you know.
I agree with that. As you were talking, I remembered the most important skill of all. I think it was actually as I was talking, and I will put a link to Fireship. Fireship is a YouTube channel.
Mhm.
So maybe you can include that one in the description.
Sure.
The most important developer skill of all is the ability to Google effectively. So we need HTML, we need CSS, we need JavaScript, and I also think we need the big picture because we need motivation, and we also need the ability to use Google effectively. I think that's another big one too. And this is the very last one that I would mention. So towards the end, we sort of talked about what do you not need. And I think the document API is a mixed world. So the document API is quite large. And some of that you do need. You do need to understand how to get an element, delete an element. I think query selector is a really nice one. And query selector is a case where I can start to shift over to CSS and show you how there's a relationship because we use the CSS selectors there. So you need to CRUD, create, read, update, and delete the DOM. You need to understand how to CRUD the DOM before you progress to React, I think. But the document API has many things that have nothing to do with any of that. And I think those can be safely avoided. So those are two. And then the last thing I would say about the document API is you do need to understand the big picture of the document API. And I think there's three pieces when I talk about the big picture of the document API. One piece is something that I've seen you talk about. And I think you talked about this in a way better than I have. And that is having the developer be able to see the elements on the page. And you sort of use the box model is a great way to do it. So I might steal some of your content there.
Sure.
So being able to understand how elements are nested, we know from the HTML, but understanding how that relates into the virtual DOM under the document object is extremely important. And understanding that I can just select out and remove or add in a DOM fragment that is a virtual fragment. I think if you talk about it with the student for maybe 20 minutes, it makes sense. But at first, it's kind of a bit strange. But that maps on directly to React. So one is like virtualization of the DOM and being able to see the elements on the screen. Two is the document window relationship. I think that's important. And then, yeah, basically certain important window methods. I do think it's good for them to know, like location API, for example. And you talked about the params as well, which is related.
Yeah. I guess location, yeah, that's a good one. I asked them to do that later down the line when they are working with React. Params, I'm only working with params when they come to learn React Router.
Okay.
That's really, really important. And now I'm in love with query,
React query?
No, the actual query in the URL.
Oh, the query string. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm in love with it, because you can put state in there. You can put state in there, and you can load your application with state straight from the URL, and that means you can send someone your application, and they can look at the same selection of field as you are, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really nice. I talked about the file reader API earlier and how that's optional and you don't need it. So I have some experience with that because originally I made them use it. So when we do the blog, I start with the HTML. They're actually putting in the HTML. And then I tell them they can have a form and they can do CRUD in memory. And then I say, oh, but what about the problems with memory? Your application might get shut down and you don't want to lose it, right? So I have them download the JSON. So I have them add a feature to download and upload a JSON file. But this ended up I found this was really complicated and confusing and not too much value, actually. And I found it was actually not related that much to React. It was a case where if they wanted to do the icing on the cake, I let them do that during their, when they pick the project. And I think that's the right way to do it. But what you're mentioning, I could use the query string instead. I think it would be simpler. And in that case, I don't have to worry about, oh, can you send me that JSON file? You just send me the URL.
Another important one is the local storage.
Local storage can be tricky. So my opinion is it's not needed, but what's your opinion? Before React. Eventually, I think it's
Before
nice.
React, I don't think it's needed before React.
So when you talk about local storage, do you also talk about the session storage?
No, just local storage.
Just local storage. One thing that's an interesting concept the developer eventually needs to learn, but I'm not sure where they need to learn it, is the difference between saving. I think when we talk about a database, that's maybe the best place to do it. The difference between having something in your browser memory and having it in a persistent storage, like local storage or something like that. So that if my app crashes, there's like something that is salvaged or saved, crash proofing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also an element of error handling. So maybe you can bring it up at that time if you're discussing error handling. That's an interesting question. Let's see. In practice, where have I talked about this? Usually I don't touch local storage all the way through, except as part of interview prep, where it's like, hey, this is a thing we haven't really used it, but maybe you should know about it for your interview. I do talk about losing data. Yeah, very early actually in vanilla world, when they're doing the blog articles, they have the CRUD form, but it's not saving anywhere. They close it, they open it, it's gone. Why? Because of in memory. So I talk about that, but I don't bring up the local storage. I think that's the difference.
For me, I combine local storage with dynamic keys. What does that mean? So for example, you have the photo app, right? And then you try to save a photo in your local storage, in your favorites. So you click it, and then you should change the icon, right? From being just an outline to being filled up as well, so you can show that this photo is actually being saved. And what most people do, they would save that photo into an array, right? That makes sense. But then when you refresh, if you just save that saved flag in that actual photo, when you refresh, it's gone, right? But the way I explain them to do is to create an object with a key, which is the ID of the photo, and then the photo is the value of the actual photo that they saved. So then when the page loads, they will see that this key exists in local storage, hence the photo is saved. The reason why I'm not using an array is because if they have 1,000 photos, they will have to find this photo specifically in that 1,000 elements array, you know what I mean? So I use that combo with the dynamic keys and the local storage for favoriting different kind of elements in the application.
I think that's a really good idea. I've done this by accident with a current student. As you know, I think I don't take a high volume of students. It's only like 1 or 2 at a time. Mm-hmm. A current student of mine, I offer 4 different services. One of them is bootcamp supplementation. Mm-hmm. So that you're not directly learning from me. You have some bootcamp, but you hate it. Mm-hmm. And I will fill in the gaps. I've actually gotten a number of clients this way. I think it's kind of funny, but if you pause, it's actually quite sad that some of these boot camps are doing that poor of a job. They would need to go out and get, in addition to their boot camp mentor, they would need to get an actual senior engineer. Anyway, they were given and they're doing Python server, Flask, and they are given a constant global object. Mm-hmm. And I know it's a constant because they're using the convention. It's all caps and underscores, yeah? Mm-hmm. So they have this map, and it's quite like what you say. In this case, they were doing vote for your favorite variety of fruit. So on the front end, they basically have a vote. They pick the radio button and then a submit form, and it does a count, increase the count. You can vote for the banana or watermelon or whatever. So she was having trouble there, the student, and we did the same way, where the form will end up passing the key, mm-hmm. and the key will look it up from the dictionary in Python, which is like the object in JavaScript, right? Mm-hmm. So, and of course, if you're doing anything with algorithms, and I know we're not talking about algorithms, but the idea of an object, which is more generally called a hash map across languages, is extremely efficient. Yep. Because you don't have to look through the array. You just go right there. If I hand you a dictionary, this is one of the reasons I like the term dictionary, even though in JavaScript world we don't really use it. We stick with objects. But if I hand you a dictionary, how big is that thing? Like a literal dictionary.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to look through each page looking for the word? Or what if I tell you it's on page 72? You just go there. Far more efficient.
That's so smart. I never thought about it like that, but
Yeah.
the technology makes so much sense, and it's in your face. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
So the embarrassing thing about this boot camp, they were giving us the constant global object. And I read her instructions. I read it 3 times. I said, are they really saying to do this? They wanted to mutate it in place. I thought, well, if you're going to do that, it shouldn't be a global constant.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a different story. And speaking of different stories, I think I've made all my important notes. I've really enjoyed this time. But my wife brought me a mocha from Starbucks. Mm-hmm. And it made me think of something which is probably for a different conversation. But there are a number of things that you can do to improve your learning that are optional but highly recommended, in my opinion. And one of those is your nutrition.
And sleep.
Right? Just the basics. Eat, sleep, make sure you're sleeping. And I think earlier you briefly talked about exercising. I think it was an analogy, but also literally exercising will keep your mental performance much better. So I think that's kind of a different conversation. If somebody wants to learn React from me, I'm not going to say, well, did you go to the gym this week?
Yeah.
Not a filtering criteria for me. But I do think the science shows you're going to learn much more effectively if you're, eating healthy. This mocha isn't healthy, but caffeine, yeah. See,
sugar-free though.
Well, and the Red Bull has some other things that are helpful too. I think one is like the taurine. So there are some nutritional elements. I think they're called nootropics, if I'm not mistaken. A certain class of nutrient that it's been shown scientifically to improve your mental performance. And I think this is actually important to mention to students.
Yeah, my fitness coach actually told me, because right now I'm sleeping more consistently from 2 a.m. till 10 a.m. That's my sleeping schedule. But I'm sleeping consistently, right? And he said that because you are doing that and you are training hard, you are gonna be less stressed, and if you are less stressed, you can find solutions, you can learn, you can...
Stress is incredible. This is something that I did not learn until far too late. I wish I had learned it earlier. Stress is so subtle in its manifestations and its effects that we almost never notice it until we're through it, that we look back and say, wow, I was really stressed. But in the moment, you would say, I'm not stressed, leave me alone.
That's why you need to look at the bigger picture, not at what you're doing today.
Yeah.
Or yesterday, But that's another, I could talk about that forever. I actually made, in my Facebook group, the link is in the description. I've made, in January or February, I've made a webinar all about how time works, I might do it again at some point. It was pretty heavy. And it was very difficult for me to explain it, mainly because I have the concept, but English not being my main language, it was very difficult to articulate properly. Maybe this time I'm gonna give it another try. I'm gonna do it again, but it's pretty good, and it's related to what you're saying right now.
Is that one recorded? That one is on your YouTube?
It's not on YouTube. It's in the Facebook group. I think you're in my Facebook group, bro. I think so. You should.
I can see that group. Yeah. I'll go back and check it out.
Yeah, it was in January or February, something like that. Well, yeah. I guess let's end it right now, and then we can have another one maybe next week or in 2 weeks or something like that. We'll stay in touch. For if people want to reach you out, your links will be in the description of this video. TikTok, Twitter.
TikTok and Twitter are the 2 best places to contact me. And then the third would be my own course website that I've mentioned, which is ladderly.io.
Ladderly.io. All right. I'll post those links. Any ending thoughts from you, John?
The only other note that I'd make, Christian, and I think you share this as well, is that today we talked about the things that you need to know before you start learning React. We touched a bit on React itself, but we really didn't get into it. And so this is not the whole story, is the last note that I would make. We also talked about briefly nutrition and things like that. So there's actually a much larger picture here. And so, yeah, I would say if they're talking to you, keep talking to you, and get the big picture, because we really want you to understand where we can add value to you personally. People are unique. Your situation's unique. And for me, I always say, let's chat, because I want to make this relevant to you, and I need to know more about you for that to happen. And there's a lot more to it than sort of the broad strokes that we gave. Although they were important, they were broad strokes for the general audience today. And there's going to be a lot more for you specifically.
For sure, 100%. There's so much that you can get from free content like YouTube. YouTube is just entertainment at the end of the day. And if you want the real deal, the links are in the description, either for John, either for talking with me. It was a nice chat. We had actually 2 weeks ago, we had another chat, but that one started a bit very convoluted, and it ended up just being saved in my hard drive. But probably we'll make another one next week or 2 weeks from now. We'll find some other topics, and if any of you has an idea for a topic that you would want covered, just comment here on YouTube, or DM me or DM John. Let us know what would you like to hear from us. And yeah, I guess that's it. I'll see you guys next week. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.